time are escorted. Ms Sturgeon.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I begin by thanking Maggie Chapman for securing this important debate. This is a topic that goes to the very heart of the moral obligation, and I use that term deliberately, that developed countries owe to those in the Global South. The devastating effects of climate change are now impossible for any politician, bar the mendacious, to deny or ignore. Here in Scotland, of course, as Maggie Chapman has just reflected on, Storm Babet has just delivered a tragic reminder that these impacts are now being felt everywhere, and my thoughts are also with those affected. But though global, the impacts do fall most acutely and massively disproportionately on countries that have done least to cause climate change, countries that are already poorer and less equipped to deal with the consequences of the emissions that have fuelled the prosperity of those of us in the developed world. For example, the carbon emissions of countries in East Africa are negligible in a global context, and yet human-induced climate change has contributed to drought and famine there, a hunger crisis that earlier this year was estimated to be claiming 2 lives every single minute. Finance provided by rich countries to help the poorest deal with climate change is woefully inadequate. Shamefully, the much-lauded $100 million a year commitment, first made 14 years ago, has still not been delivered in full. But finance, as well as being inadequate, is also far too limited in scope. Current funding covers mitigation action to reduce emissions and adaptation action to build resilience through, for example, flood defences. Both of these matter, of course they do. They are hugely important. But not covered at all at this stage is the loss and damage being wrought by the impacts of climate change that are of a type and scale that can no longer be mitigated or adapted to. These impacts are already causing loss of life, loss of livelihoods and enforced changes to how and where people live, and they are doing so on a truly massive scale. Now, countries and individuals across the Global South have been campaigning for explicit recognition of and recompense for loss and damage for 30 years. And yet it was only at COP26 in Glasgow that the first glimmer of a breakthrough was made. I am very proud that Scotland played its part, becoming the first developed country in the world to pledge funding for loss and damage. Momentum continued last year at COP27 in Egypt, with agreement to set up a dedicated fund and the establishment of a transitional committee to agree the detail. Again, Scotland was at the forefront of efforts to make that progress. However, it will be at COP28 in Dubai in just a few weeks' time that we will know if these promises are to be honoured, indeed if it is any longer possible to expect Global South countries to keep faith with the multilateral process at all. I hope for the best, but already fear the worst. By all accounts, progress in the Transitional Committee is nowhere near where it should be. So in the short time I have today, I simply want to add my voice to those demanding true climate justice. COP28 must ensure that the Loss and Damage Fund becomes operational without delay. It must be open to all developing countries. The finance it offers must be additional to that already available for mitigation and adaptation. It must be in the form of grants, not loans. To deepen the indebtedness of developing countries would not address injustice, it would compound it. And it must cover the full range of the loss and damages being suffered. That means not just the impacts of sudden events like floods and storms, but also slow onset climatic changes, and also not just economic loss, like damage to infrastructure, but non-economic loss of life, culture and heritage. My final call, Presiding Officer, before I conclude, falls closer to home. I understand, probably more than most in this chamber, the financial pressures confronting government, but I do ask the Scottish Government to ensure that our overall Climate Justice Fund commitment for this Parliament, increased during COP26, is delivered in full, and that as a bare minimum, and I stress bare minimum, we honour in full the world-leading commitments made to loss and damage funding. This is a matter of basic justice. It's the obligation we owe to those in the Global South paying the price of our prosperity. I hope Scotland continues to lead the way.